My children wait for a mother's embrace, and you wait for mercy. The midday sun turned the earth into red-hot iron. Billy walked along the dusty road that cut through the valley, carrying only a faded leather bag and the weight of a promise that had echoed in his mind for 3 weeks. Farmer McCready had been clear on that rainy day in Tombstone. There was honest work waiting for him, a safe roof over his head, and the chance to start over away from the ghosts that had haunted him from Kansas. The surrounding landscape stretched out in waves of heat and silence. Distant mountains cast blue shadows on the horizon, while the dry wind carried the smell of sage and parched earth. Billy paused for a moment, wiping the sweat from his brow with the sleeve of his shirt, and watched the fine smoke rising from a chimney in the valley below. McCready Farm finally appeared before him, a collection of wooden buildings that seemed small against the immensity of the territory. As he got closer, details began to take shape. The main house was sturdy but simple, with a balcony that stretched across the front. A faded red barn dominated the right side of the property, while paddocks delineated areas where a few horses grazed peacefully. Chickens scratched near a well, and a woman in a blue dress worked in a small garden next to the house. Billy slowed his pace as the woman lifted her face toward him. She had brown hair tied up in a loose bun, and her hand still held a small gardening shovel. For an instant their gazes crossed across the distance, and he could see the hesitation in their movements. Sarah McCready had heard of him. She was sure of that. He probably knew about the reputation he carried, the rumors that ran about the years he lived in the border towns. He continued walking to the gate of the property, where he stopped and took off his hat in a respectful gesture. The woman approached slowly, wiping her hands on a cloth she wore in her apron. Her steps were cautious, but there was no fear in her eyes, only a careful assessment of the man who stood before her. From inside the house came the sounds of children playing, muffled laughter that contrasted with the silent tension of the moment. Billy knew that there were 2 small children, a 7-year-old girl and a 5-year-old boy, who had been motherless for a little over a year. It was part of the reason McCready needed help on the farm, someone he could trust to share the heavy lifting while he took care of the kids. Sarah stopped a few feet away, still holding the cloth in her hands. His posture was upright, dignified, but there was a vulnerability in his slightly hunched shoulders that Billy recognized immediately. It was the mark of someone who had lost so much and yet was still standing, protecting what was left of the family he helped raise. The wind blew between them, kicking up small clouds of dust and making the dry leaves dance in lazy circles. Billy waited, respecting the time she needed to form her first impression. He knew that the next few words would be crucial, that they would determine whether he would be received as the worker McCready had hired or as another threat in a world that had already taken too much from this family. Gradually, he noticed other details of the property that revealed the daily struggle of its residents. The fences needed repairs at several points, some porch steps were loose, and the barn roof showed signs of seepage at one end. It was work for more than one man, especially with 2 young children requiring constant attention. Sarah finally moved, taking a few steps toward the gate. Her features softened slightly, and Billy could see that she had made a decision. Whatever judgment she had made of him in those moments of silent observation, it seemed to have been favorable enough to allow him to continue. The shadow of the mountains began to lengthen, even with the sun still high in the sky. Billy knew that the farm work day started early and ended late, and that there was much to be done before he could prove his worth. But for the first time in months, she felt something like hope growing in her chest, an almost forgotten feeling that perhaps she could find peace in this remote place. The first few days at McCready Farm passed like blank pages being slowly filled in. Billy would wake up before dawn, when the sky was still carrying the cool colors of the night, and walk to the barn where he slept in a small back room. The smell of hay and leather had been with him since he had arrived, an aroma that gradually became familiar and comforting. Thomas Macready was a man of few words, but his instructions were clear and precise. There were fences to fix in the north pasture, horses to shoe, and the roof of the barn needed attention before the fall rains came. Billy worked in silence, his hands rediscovering the satisfaction of honest work. Every hammer pounded and every board nailed, building something more than just repairs. The children watched him from afar in the early days. Emma, the golden-haired girl, peered out of the kitchen window as he worked in the yard. His younger brother Samuel was bolder, approaching to a safe distance before running back to the house when Billy looked in his direction. There was a silent dance of curiosity and caution that Billy respected, knowing that trust couldn't be forced. Sarah remained a constant but discreet presence. She prepared meals, took care of the children, maintained the vegetable garden, and even found time to help with small farm chores. Billy saw her working from dawn until well after sunset, her efficient and determined movements revealing a strength that went far beyond delicate appearance. It was during the second week that the routine began to break down. Billy was repairing the pasture fence when he saw Samuel approaching, this time without running. The boy was carrying a glass of fresh water and stopped a few meters away, extending his arm in a shy but genuine gesture. Billy accepted the water with a grateful nod, and for the first time the boy smiled before rushing back to the house. Small moments like this began to multiply. Emma appeared one day while he was shoeing a horse, sitting on the fence to observe the work. Her quiet presence was comforting, and Billy found that he worked more carefully when he knew he was being watched by the girl's prying eyes. Thomas also began to relax around him. Conversations over meals, once limited to work instructions, began to include comments about the weather, about neighbors, about harvest plans. Billy learned that Thomas's wife had been a school teacher in town before they moved to the farm, and that she had left a small library that the children still visited every night before bed. The most significant revelation came during a particularly hot night, when Billy was finishing fixing a hole in the barn roof. Sarah appeared with a lamp, lighting the way as he descended from the stairs. For a moment they stood in front of each other in the golden circle of light, and she talked about how the children had been sleeping better since he had arrived. There was something in her voice, a carefully controlled vulnerability, that made Billy understand that her presence meant more than just extra hands for work. The farm had become a safer, more complete place, with someone to trust sharing the daily responsibilities. But it was the morning he found Samuel crying behind the barn that Billy truly understood the weight of the situation. The boy had injured his knee when he fell from a fence, and the tears he shed seemed to carry more than just physical pain. Billy knelt beside him, offering his handkerchief and waiting patiently for the tears to dry. When Emma came looking for her brother, Billy saw in her eyes the same silent need that he recognized in himself. They were children who had lost too much too soon, trying to find stability in a world that seemed constantly in motion. And somehow, his presence had become part of that stability. That night, as he watched the stars outside the barn, Billy allowed a cautious hope to grow in his chest. Perhaps he could be more than just a temporary worker. Perhaps he could become part of this makeshift family that fate had placed in his path. The night wind carried the smell of distant rain, promising changes to come. Billy closed his eyes and, for the first time in a long time, slept unchased by the ghosts of the past. The first sign of trouble came with the dust of 3 horsemen on the horizon. Billy was repairing the pump from the well when he saw the cloud approaching from the main road, and something in the rhythm of the beating of the hooves made his stomach twitch. He knew the sound of men riding with haste and purpose, and it rarely meant good news to those who stood in the way. Thomas left the house when he heard the horses stop at the gate. His shoulders stiffened as he recognized the man leading the group, a tall guy with a grey mustache and a cold look that Billy had never seen before. The silence that followed was heavy, loaded with history and old tensions that needed no words to be understood. The man introduced himself as Clayton Morse, owner of the neighboring farm to the north. His voice was overly polite, polished in a way that made every word sound like a veiled threat. He had come, he said, to discuss issues of ownership and water rights that needed to be resolved before they became bigger problems. Billy continued working on the pump, but his ears caught every word of the conversation. Morse was talking about old documents, about property boundaries that might not be as clear as Thomas believed, about rights of way that could affect McCready Farm's access to the creek that provided water for the animals. Sarah appeared on the porch, drying her hands on her apron, but she didn't go down the steps. His posture was tense, alert, like an animal that senses danger in the air. The children remained indoors, but Billy could see their small faces pressed against the living room window, feeling the change in atmosphere even though he didn't fully understand what was happening. When Morse and his men finally left, they left behind more than just horse footprints in the dusty dirt. There was a sense of menace hanging over the farm, a shadow that had not existed before the visit. Thomas walked up to Billy, his grim expression revealing concerns that went beyond a simple dispute between neighbors. In the following days, the tension intensified. Morse sent men to mark trees along the boundary between the properties, always a little farther into the McCready land than he should have. Small incidents began to occur. A section of fence was torn down during the night, allowing cattle to scatter, and water from the stream was diverted by a makeshift dam upstream. Billy observed everything with the experience of someone who had seen similar conflicts before. He knew the signs of a carefully orchestrated campaign of intimidation, designed to force a small family to give up their land. It was an ancient story in the West, repeated in hundreds of valleys and plains where law was still a distant suggestion. The situation reached a critical point when Samuel disappeared during an afternoon. The boy had gone out to get eggs in the chicken coop and simply did not return. Sarah and Thomas searched the entire property, their voices calling out the boy's name, echoing through the empty fields, each unanswered echo adding to the panic in their hearts. Billy found the small footprints heading toward the stream, but they disappeared on the muddy bank where the water had been diverted. Something in the arrangement of the marks on the earth told him that the boy had not fallen accidentally. There were signs of other horses, bootprints that did not belong to the McCready family. As the sun began to set and Samuel still hadn't been found, Billy made a decision that he knew would change everything. He saddled his horse and set off toward Morse's estate, carrying only his determination and the certainty that some situations could only be resolved face to face. The moon was rising when he arrived at Morse's farm, a larger and more prosperous estate than the McCready's, with new buildings and well-maintained fences. Lights shone on the windows of the main house, and the sound of male voices came from within, harsh laughter that stopped abruptly when Billy knocked on the door. Morse opened it in person, his expression changing from surprise to something more calculated when he recognized the visitor. Behind him, Billy can see other men sitting around a table, letters scattered between bottles of whiskey. The room smelled of smoke and tension, and there was something in the men's smiles that confirmed their worst suspicions. The confrontation that followed was silent but loaded with meaning. Morse denied any knowledge of Samuel's whereabouts, but his eyes betrayed a cruel satisfaction that made Billy's blood boil. There was pleasure in this man, in seeing the despair of a family, and Billy recognized in him the kind of predator who fed on the suffering of others. When Billy finally left Morse's estate, it was with the certainty that he had met his enemy, but also with the terrifying realization that Samuel was in real danger. The boy had become a cog in a cruel game, and Billy knew that the next few hours would determine not only the fate of the child, but the future of the entire McCready family. The dawn brought answers that Billy did not expect to find. As Sarah brewed coffee with trembling hands and Thomas walked nervously through the kitchen, Billy followed a foreboding that led him to the abandoned barn on the border between the two properties. It was a place no one had used in years, half hidden by overgrown bushes and deep shadows. Samuel was there, bound but unharmed, his big eyes shining with relief when he saw Billy appear in the driveway. The boy had not been hurt, but the fear on his small face told a story that made Billy clench his fists. There were rope marks on their wrists, and their clothes were soiled from the damp dirt on the barn floor. While untying the boy, Billy noticed something more disturbing than the kidnapping itself. Samuel had been left in a place where he would be easily found, almost as if Morse wanted him to be discovered. It wasn't about keeping the child away from the family. It was about sending a clear message. No one was safe, and at any moment the situation could get worse. Samuel's return to the farm was greeted with tears of relief and desperate hugs. Sarah held her son to her chest, as if she would never let go, while Emma clung to her brother's arm with an intensity that revealed the terror she had felt. Thomas remained silent, but Billy could see in his eyes the same cold resolution that he felt growing in his own chest. That afternoon, while the children rested and Sarah watched their every move, Thomas and Billy sat on the porch for a conversation they both knew needed to happen. The farmer talked about his wife, about how they had come to that valley in search of peace and prosperity, about the dreams they had built together before the fever took her away. Billy listened in silence, realizing that Thomas was entrusting him with more than just the family story. She was sharing the weight of responsibility, the fear of not being able to protect what was left of the people she loved. It was the kind of conversation men had when they knew hard times were coming. By the time the conversation was over, they had both come to the same silent conclusion. Morse would not stop with intimidation. Samuel's kidnapping had been just the beginning, a show of power designed to force the family to abandon their land. The next step would be more direct, more dangerous, and they needed to be prepared. Billy spent the night checking the locks, inspecting the windows, planning escape routes in case they were needed. His past experience, those years he had tried to forget, came back to the surface as instincts that never really go away. He knew how men like Morse thought, he knew his tactics, and he was determined to use that knowledge to protect his new family. Morse's response was not long in coming. The next morning, 3 of his men showed up at the property with documents that claimed to prove that the Macready farm was built on land that did not belong to them. The papers looked official, with seals and signatures that could fool anyone who didn't know how to look for the inconsistencies. Billy studied the documents carefully, noting details that would go unnoticed by most people. The dates did not match, the names of the former owners were slightly altered, and there were erasures that suggested forgery. Morse had invested time and money to create a convincing hoax, but he hadn't been careful enough. Thomas rejected the documents, but Billy could see doubt growing in his eyes. What if there was some truth in those papers? What if the whole struggle to keep the farm was based on an illusion? It was exactly the reaction Morse had hoped for, the slow erosion of trust that would eventually lead to surrender. That night, Billy made a decision that he knew would change everything forever. He could not allow Morse to continue terrorizing his family, and he could not wait for the distant authorities to resolve a situation that was becoming more dangerous by the day. He had long since learned that sometimes the only language men like Morse understood was force. He saddled his horse in the wee hours of the morning when the world was still shrouded in silence and shadows. This time, he wasn't just going to confront Morse with words. It went with the determination of a man who had found something worth fighting for and who would not allow it to be taken away from him again. Before leaving, Billy stopped at the barn door and looked toward the house where the people who had become his family slept. Samuel and Emma, Sarah and Thomas, all trusting that he would find a way to keep them safe. It was a responsibility he fully accepted, even though he knew it could cost him everything he had built in the last few weeks. The pre-dawn wind carried the smell of change, and Billy rode toward what he knew would be the final showdown with Clayton Morse. The sun was rising slowly over the valley when Billy arrived at Morse's estate for the second time. This time, however, he did not go to the main house. He followed a side trail that led to the office where Morse conducted his business, a small wooden building where Billy knew he would find not only the man, but also the evidence of his schemes. The door was unlocked, and Billy entered without making a sound. Morse was alone, leaning over a table covered with papers and maps. When she looked up and saw Billy standing on the threshold, her expression went from surprise to something close to amusement. It was as if he had been waiting for this moment, planned for him from the beginning. Billy placed the forged documents on the table, next to the maps Morse was studying. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm and collected, charged with an authority that had been facing men like that for years. He knew about the forgeries, about the attempts at intimidation, and about Morse's plans to expand his estate at the expense of smaller families. What Morse didn't expect was that Billy would also bring other roles. During his journey through the territory, Billy had met people in neighboring towns who had similar stories about Clayton Morse, families who had lost their land through similar tactics, documents that proved a pattern of behavior that the authorities could not ignore. Morse's confidence began to waver as Billy spread this evidence on the table. They were letters, testimonies, even some of the original documents that Morse thought he had destroyed. Billy had spent years learning to read people, and he could see the exact moment when Morse realized that his game had come to an end. The confrontation that followed was more a battle of wills than physical strength. Billy made it clear that evidence was already on its way to territorial authorities, that several families had banded together to file formal complaints, and that Morse faced the loss not only of his schemes, but possibly of his own property through legal proceedings. Morse tried to negotiate, offering money, promising to leave the Macready family alone if Billy forgot what he had discovered. But Billy knew men like him all too well. He knew that promises made under pressure were broken as soon as the pressure subsided. The only permanent solution was to ensure that Morse no longer had the power to threaten anyone. When Billy finally left office, he was carrying something more valuable than gold. Morse's written guarantee that he would leave the territory within a week, selling his land to anyone who wanted to buy it at the fair market price. It was not only a victory for the Macready family, but for all the families Morse had tormented over the years. The return to the farm was unlike any previous arrival. Thomas was waiting on the porch, and for the first time in weeks, there was something resembling peace in his posture. Billy turned over the original Macready estate documents, the real ones, which he had found in Morse's office, along with the assurance that the problems with the neighbor were definitively resolved. Sarah showed up at the door with the children, and Billy saw in her eyes a gratitude that went far beyond words. Samuel ran towards him, and for the first time, Billy allowed himself to accept the child's embrace without reservation. Emma followed her brother, and for a moment Billy found himself surrounded by the family he had risked everything to protect. That night over dinner, there was a conversation that Billy knew would change his life forever. Thomas talked about making his position on the farm permanent, about how he had become more than an employee, more than a temporary helper. He had become part of the family, someone they trusted completely. Billy accepted the offer with the humility of a man who had found more than he bargained for when he arrived in that dusty valley weeks earlier. He had sought only honest work and a roof over his head, but he had found something far more precious, a home, a family, and the chance to be someone better than he had been in the past. Weeks later, when Morse actually left the territory as promised, Billy was repairing the pasture fence with Samuel, helping by his side. The boy held the nails seriously, proud to be contributing to the work of the farm. Emma was in the garden with Sarah, learning how to take care of the vegetables that would feed the family during the winter. The valley had returned to its natural peace, but now it was a peace conquered, protected, valued by those who knew how much it had cost to maintain it. Billy looked up at the mountains on the horizon and allowed himself to smile. He had found what he had always been looking for without knowing it, a place where he belonged, people who cared about him, and the certainty that some endings really could be happy. The wind blew gently through the fields, carrying with it the promise of future seasons, of growth and harvests, of children growing up safe and loved. Billy went back to work, knowing that he had finally arrived home. If you've come this far, it's because the stories of redemption and family touch your soul as much as ours. Subscribe to the channel to receive more exciting narratives of the American Wild West, where brave men and women faced not only the challenges of a wild land,